Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History by podcast. Today, I'm joined by PhD candidate Jack Bull, and today we're going to be discussing what are the earliest attestations of Paul the Apostle's epistles, the letters of Paul. So, welcome back to the podcast, Bull.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again.
Of course, always nice to have you on. So, you have a new website you like to show the audience, and also a new Patreon.
Yeah, so the blog and the website is more a response to
Mm-hmm.
your watchers and listeners. A few wanted to keep up to date with my work, and I was very flattered. So I thought I'd build a website and have a place for people to access that. Alongside that, I also set up a Patreon page for those to support me financially. As some of your listeners also might know, I'll be leaving academia probably at the end of my PhD, at least for a short time, because there's no money in it and I'm getting married and I've got to support myself somehow. But I don't want to give up the dream, as it were. And I think I have something to contribute. So, it's just a place that if they want to support my work and they like what they do, and like what I do, sorry, then, they can reach out to me that way as well.
All right, so you want to share screens from your website
From the
and your
website, I
Patreon?
actually don't. I actually don't have that up, but I assumed you linked it in the description.
Yeah, I put the link in the description. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so the blog I'll be posting every Friday, on a variety of topics, usually based on what I've been researching that week. So
Mhm.
this next one that's coming is partially a response to also what I've been doing. I'll be presenting today, um, and it will cover all things early Christianity. Sometimes the odd politics thing in there every now and
Mhm.
again, but for the most part, it'll be exactly what you'd expect to see on this channel, and then some. Um, and it'll also be a place where, again, if you want to ask me questions or reach out to me about my research, give me some tips on how I can improve the website as well, because I'm a complete novice at all of this sort of thing, they can do that too. And eventually, also, it'll be linked up to a Discord, a place for us to chat and get to know each other as well a bit better.
Before we get to the PowerPoint slides, I just want to say something about the Discord real quick. So some people have asked why they can't join my Discord server. It's been going through some renovation, and I'm almost done renovating it. And when it's done, I'll post a new link to join the Discord server in the community tab, and then eventually all the videos will have the link updated in the description. Jotbull's Discord patron, his Patreon Discord role is actually in my server. So if people want to join his Patreon and become part of my server, not just my server, but part of his section of the server where you can interact with him more frequently, you will be granted a role, Jotbull patron, and you can access the private chat room.
Yeah, you get two for the price of one. You can join my Discord and get a special place in Jacob. So it's yeah, like I said, two for the price of one.
All right, so you ready to show the slides?
Yes, let's go for it. Let me see here. Aha. Very good. Can you see all right?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay. So, as I mentioned, this blog post that I've been writing over the past week has been about certainty in scholarship and the levels of certainty that scholars show in their work and the faith they put in our predecessors and their conclusions. This is no better displayed than in the cases of the canonical Gospels and St. Paul. In both of those cases, we have become entrenched as a scholarly community by accepting, almost without critique, that the Gospels were written between 50 and maybe 120, and that Paul wrote in the 50s slash the early 60s. But it's my position that certainty in our business can sometimes be misplaced and often leaves us uncritical about some of the things we should be more critical of. In particular, as I want to demonstrate today, the dating of the Pauline epistles. The title is called The Interrogative Pronoun in brackets of Paul because I hope to question again the who's, the what's, the why's, the wherefores, and maybe even the occasional whence of Paul and his travels and his epistles. To do that, though, I want to refresh some of your listeners and viewers with the traditional understanding or the conservative understanding of Paul and his journeys. It's long been believed that Paul made 3 journeys, I would argue, and then one final trip to his death. These are given to us in the book of Acts and begin in 48 AD. And I should point out that scholars quibble either side of this date as to when it exactly might have happened, but it's recounted to us in Acts 13 and 14. Himself and Barnabas and John Mark go from Antioch through to Cyprus, Salamis, Paphos, Perga, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Attalia, and Antioch they return to. And they go on this journey. It's almost like a fantasy book in some sense. Not that it didn't happen per se, but that they go through trials and tribulations, preaching their message, meeting new people. It's a wonderful set of tales until they eventually return. He then goes on his second trip a couple of years later in the early 50s, as recounted in Acts 16 through 18. And this time he brings his friend Silas because he falls out with Barnabas about the leaving of John Mark leaving in the last trip early before the end of the trip. And this time he goes to Derbe and Lystra, where he meets Timothy. He then goes to Phrygia and, as you've noted, I've highlighted red Galatia. He tries to go to Bithynia, but gets denied access. And he continues on to more of the churches we know and love that he wrote letters to: Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus. And then when he returns back to Jerusalem, Acts barely gives us a sentence before he jumps into his next trip. It's almost like he was only back for 10 minutes, dropped off his stuff, washed his clothes, and came back out again. So in the 50s AD, maybe to the mid to late, he goes to Galatia, Phrygia. He spends 2 years at Ephesus, Macedonia, back to Ephesus, Caesarea, and finally back to Jerusalem. He then makes his final and fatal trip, in some sense, to Rome, of which there is no return leg because he is martyred. And there is some argument that along his travels and along his journeys, he might also have made it to Spain on another trip. And you can look at Romans 15:24 and 1 Clement 5:6, and Eusebius also talks about reaching the far west. But for our debate, whether he made it to Spain is sort of neither here nor there. What matters for us is these 3 trips plus the journey to Rome, because it's here that he writes his letters. And so here I've given you the traditional dating of the Pauline epistles, and you'll notice a couple of things about these dates. First of all, they're not very precise. In fact, I've actually given more precise dates from conservative scholars than well, probably too precise, I would say. Sometimes that these dates go for a much longer period of time. But for the most part, scholars accept 7 Pauline epistles as authentic. They are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philemon, and in addition, Philippians. But you can see I have highlighted that blue because there is some debate around the origin of Philippians as perhaps a composite letter, or perhaps 2 or 3 letters melded into one. So they might all be genuinely Pauline, but short letters written to different places which were then merged to create one. This is debatable, but in any sense, 7 letters are accepted. Then there's the ones in yellow. They are disputed among scholars, although I must admit that the amount of scholars that are still advocating for 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians as genuinely Pauline has diminished substantially over the last 20 or 30 years. But again, if we were to take traditional dating, according to what our earliest forefathers believed, they'd be written in the time of Paul, hence 49, 51, 59, 62, respectively. You can see in brackets, though, particularly with Colossians and Ephesians, the dates that scholars are more likely to give when asked about these letters. And then in hot red, lastly, we get 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, the pastoral epistles as they're known. These may well be 2nd century texts, or at the very least, late 1st century texts. And scholars have known for some time and have recognised, and for the most part are freely open to admit, that these are certainly not Paul. They are Deutero-Paul. But again, I give you the dates, if they were written by Paul, when they might have been written. So this gives you a flavour of where we're at as a scholarly community. We like 7 of them. We're not sure about 3 of them, although we know which side we'd come down on if we had to. And the other 3, the pastorals, are set to one side. So let's focus then on why scholars think that these 7 epistles are the ones of Paul. Now, I do not have time in this presentation to go over all of the reasons why they are considered Pauline. However, we can go through some of the basic arguments and assess them. And the arguments in favour of these 7 epistles that scholars regard as genuine is split into 2 sections: internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence being what's inside the text itself, what does the text say of itself, and external evidence being what do other authors and texts say of the Pauline epistles. So we start, as is usually a convention, with the internal evidence. The first piece of evidence that scholars use to justify their position that Paul wrote these letters is that it self-identifies as being written by Paul. Now, this may seem a bit weak and a little bit of a given, let's say, but actually, to a large extent, this is quite important. In the case of Hebrews, for example, which does not identify as being written by Paul, it can very easily be dismissed as not being Pauline. So it's not the case that just because it says, well, I'm Paul and I wrote this, it means it definitely is. But if the opposite were true, and let's say Romans said it did not give an author, that would go against it being in Paul's favour. The second piece of internal evidence is that the letters date themselves roughly 20 years after the death of Jesus. And you can see in Galatians 1 and 2 and in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul makes mention of the apostles, who are at this point still alive, and Paul's persecution of the early church. He doesn't allow for a lot of time to have passed from Jesus' death and resurrection, whether it be a fictional or real or reality, to the point where his ministry kicks off. Therefore, if the letters were written by Paul, and they are written roughly 20 years after his death, so these two things come together. Paul likely lived then. The letters seem to indicate that's the period they're from. It's all coming together. In addition, the text shows no real knowledge of the Jewish war. This is debated, and some say that Paul does, but there's certainly no very clear, explicit reference that says a line like, and then the temple was destroyed, or and then the Jews were oppressed or suppressed, and the Romans came in, etc. So if it doesn't know the Jewish war, it must be before the Jewish war, so the theory goes. The problem with internal evidence, however, is that it can be rather circular. The text is true because it says it is. The text is written in that period because it seems like it is. Therefore, in my opinion, the best way we can assess the authenticity and integrity of texts is by looking at external evidence and their reception. One example of this is the use of Paul, again, as advocates of the 7 letters would say, the use of Paul in the Gospel of Mark. One occasion that springs to mind is the need to pay taxes and the story given in Mark 12:13 through 17, where Jesus gives that famous phrase, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's. And for Paul, this question of tax is also something that that takes a part takes a hold in his letters. And so I emphasize again, as the theory goes, Mark was using Paul and placing into Jesus's mouth disciplines or practices or theologies that Paul held. A retrospective writing into the lips of Jesus, things that Christians now practiced because of Paul. But it's not just Mark. We also have other early Christian texts. 1 Clement, Ignatius. I'm always going to put him for those who know my work. I do like Ignatius. Et al. There are loads of these. Loads of people who mention the name of Paul. And lastly, for our external evidence, for the sake of our debate today, the epistles are present in canon lists, such as the Muratorian fragment, i.e., they are showing reception again. Happy days. If we can show they're received, then we can assume safely they were written. Now, these 6 points of internal and external evidence, as I have said, are not exhaustive, but they are some of the constituent parts of the defence of the 7 letters. And along with these arguments and others, conclusions by scholars have led us to this point. Richard Carrier says there is inadequate evidence to argue for any other date than the 50s AD for the Pauline epistles. On another side of the debate, but with the same position on the Pauline letters, undisputed Paulines, Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. So we have Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier, very different backgrounds and beliefs about a whole range of things, but yet they agree on this. So too David Orne. 7 of the letters attributed to Paul are almost universally accepted as authentic. So too Jimmy Dunn. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon are certainly Paul's own. I could have given the next hour and a half to quoting scholars who accept this position. I cannot tell you the extent to which this is the consensus. But for me, although I appreciate the arguments, and I do not discount it as a possibility that these are the 7 authentic letters of Paul, I want to raise some issues, some problems that I don't think the scholarly community is choosing to engage with in the way that they should do. I want to pick on some of the 6 arguments that I've just put forward. As again, I said, they're not exhaustive, but if I could show at least as a principle that some of them are massively flawed, then we might be able to at least start the debate. So the first argument was that the author says he's Paul. Now, I mentioned at the time as well that this is rather weak, because so do the pastorals and the Paul's letters to Seneca and other letters that are not Pauline. Because obviously, and this stands to reason, if you want to justify your new theology or your new practice, you want to attribute it to an apostle. And to do that, you have to name them. So it makes absolute sense that Paul is going to be named in any pseudo-Pauline literature. In addition to that, and thanks to Jacob for this, he brought to my attention, which has also been known for some time, however, that a lot of the epistles do not actually say that their sole author is Paul.
But they're actually co-authored.
And there it is, right? And this is something that you will rarely find in books on Paul or textbooks, or even in when people speak of them. They'll say Paul's letter to X, but they will never say, well, Timothy had a hand in this too. Silas is mentioned here. It's always Paul's letter. I attend a Catholic church, as some of you may have known, and every day when the priest gets up, he says a reading from the letter of St. Paul to Colossians, Thessalonians, etc. No one ever says a reading from Paul, Silas, and Timothy to the Thessalonians. It's subtle, but it's important. particularly in the way that we choose to refer to these things. We must be as accurate as we can be. Okay, it's a bit of a mouthful to say every time Paul cites the Timothy's letter to the Thessalonians, but it's something that should be in the back of our heads as we're doing it. Which again raises the problem of authorship, because even the texts themselves do not just claim to be Pauline. Problem number one. Problem number 2 and 3 are both linked, i.e. the letters date themselves roughly 20 years after the death of Jesus and have no knowledge of the Jewish war. I've used this example before on the podcast, that if I wish to write an autobiography of Winston Churchill, I'm probably going to refrain from mentioning the Iraq War or the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, this sounds like a facetious and stupid thing to say, but it's not the case that our ancestors, in particularly early Christians, were stupid. They were very clever. They were subtle. They knew that they had to sell their position as if it was of Paul himself. Now, in the case of the Gospels with Jesus, you can get away with prophecy, right? Because if you want Jesus to be divine and Jesus wants to predict the future, okay, you can anachronistically apply that back. But you can't do that to Paul, because he's not God. He's not a prophet in that sense. He's just a man. So what Paul can't do is predict that, just as before I came on the podcast this evening, that Croatia would beat Brazil on penalties in the World Cup. That can't happen. They know that, hence why the letters date themselves and show no knowledge of past events. But again, by this criteria, just on internal evidence, for the most part, our authentic, disputed, and spurious epistles, and I note here also the lost epistles, all fulfill this criteria. The letters of Seneca the Younger to Paul and reverse and their responses, not reverse, and responses could easily fit all of the internal criteria I've just mentioned. Seneca lived around the right time, probably the right area. He spoke the languages, nothing out of the ordinary. Again, if Paul had a correspondence with Antoninus Pius, well, okay, well, there's a question. But Seneca the Younger, probably fine. The only purpose of noting the lost epistles on the right-hand side is that we don't actually know what they say, and they are actually theoretical. But it's important to note again that just when we're dealing with the Pauline epistles, these 3 or 4, probably did exist at some point. And again, it must not be discounted from any conversation we have. So then what about the issue with the external evidence? The use of Paul in Mark, for example. Well, on this, I can sort of see a point. Here I can say, well, yeah, they do seem to show a similar message. But is that really enough to show a literary dependency? To say for certain, beyond reasonable doubt, that Mark uses Paul? You see, one of the problems I've faced in the reception of the Pauline literature in the Apostolic Fathers is scholars seeing similarities between texts. And again, I've done a show on this on Jacob's channel before. Scholars seeing similarities and parallels between texts when only 1 or 2 words are the same and they share a similar motif out of context. If one wanted to say truly that Mark was using Paul, I think they would probably have to show not just a singular offhand comment or similarity. It would have to be a sustained usage of the Pauline literature. So even if one was to accept that Mark might have used Paul here, or at least they share a common tradition, I don't think it's quite enough to claim it's a reception of a text. And at this point, my colleagues tend to apply for me to read the Apostolic Fathers. As I mentioned, 1 Clement, Ignatius, and friends. But here I run into an even bigger argument. Because while they do mention Paul, they never quote from his letters. And if they do, my goodness, do they miss the point? Here I give a table of this. Now, red means that the text is not attested at all in the book, in the top row. Yellow means that there is an ambiguous, debatable quotation, reference, or allusion to the Pauline text. Green means it's fairly reasonable to assert that it did come from Pauline literature. And so by looking at this, we can see a flood of red, a little bit of yellow, and not a lot of green. So let's go through them one by one. The Didache, okay, you're an advocate of the 7 letters. You might also believe that the Didache is a very early text, and therefore it could even be, in its extremity, a contemporaneous work written at the same time as St. Paul was writing. I don't think that's true necessarily, but the argument could be made, which is why the author doesn't know Paul, because Paul was being written and it hadn't been disseminated yet. Fair enough. Then you go to Barnabas. Well, that doesn't give us a lot of information either. It has one, maybe, reference to Romans. Not helpful. 1 Clement. Okay. Couple of references. Romans and 1 Corinthians. And then some ambiguous ones as well. But the problem is that if 1 Clement has got Paul, in particular the entirety of the Pauline literature, he really misses the boat when it comes to resurrection. You see, for Paul, resurrection is central. Anyone who's read more than 2 or 3 letters of Paul knows that Paul is Mr. Resurrection. 1 Clement, on the other hand, only mentions the resurrection once, and it almost gets regarded as a footnote. It's given a glancing pass and move on. The resurrection of the saints is mentioned often, but the resurrection of Jesus, take it or leave it. So 1 Clement may have quoted from Romans or 1 Corinthians, but Lord knows which version it was, or if he did have it, the full version of Romans and 1 Corinthians as we have it in the canon today, they didn't get much to the resurrection. But alas, we then fall into darkness again with the Shepherd of Hamas and the 3-letter collection of Ignatius of Antioch, who do not mention Paul even once. Or his letters, I should say. They mention the person of Paul, but not his letters. Now, I draw now particular attention to Ignatius, my wheelhouse, my friend, my companion, with whom I spend every day at this point during my PhD. You can see a huge difference between the 3-letter collection of Ignatius, which is widely considered by scholarship to be a redaction of the 7 letters. The 7 letters believed to have been written around the beginning of the 1st century. The 3 letters being chopped, and then those 7 letters were then chopped up into the 3-letter collection towards the end of the 2nd century, is the common consensus. I, however, believe that it went the other way, that Ignatius genuinely wrote 3 letters, and they were interpolated to make 7. If you believe, as I do, that 3 became 7 by the work of an interpolator, one can see how they might want to introduce Pauline literature into Ignatius to give Paul that leg up, that foothold in early Christianity. However, if the common scholarly consensus is to be believed, that the 7-letter collection came first, it would mean that a Christian at the end of the 2nd century chose to remove all of the Pauline quotes, and I should add gospel quotes from Matthew and John, from the corpus and put them to one side. I think that is an untenable position to hold, but alas, that's the scholarly consensus right now. So they use Ignatius often to justify that Paul certainly knew 1 Corinthians. And I've put a couple of books there at the bottom for you to check out, where, in particular, Barnett, but who claim without hesitation that Ignatius knew Paul. Then we move to Polycarp. more ambiguity, I'm afraid. Perhaps 1 Corinthians and Ephesians of all books. And then 2 Clement sort of places us back where we're used to being, with our blinkers on in the dark. So you can see then that the two arguments they've put forward don't really work. So we come on to our last one. We have great hope. The epistles are present in early canon lists, like the Muratorian fragment. I apologise for the white writing. The Muratorian fragment has got confused dating. There are some who date it to the late 2nd century, and some who even date it up to the 4th. But let me be generous and say that it's late 2nd century. Let's give it its earliest possible position. Okay, it gives all of the Pauline letters, alongside at least 2 of the Gospels and Jude, and also includes the Apocalypse of Peter out of nowhere. But the problem is, if this is the earliest New Testament canon that we have for the canonical Paul, what we're saying is we have to wait 100 years plus to get someone to attest it. Now let that sink in, because we believe as a scholarly community that Paul is the most influential, most significant figure, even more so than Peter, or maybe even all of the other apostles put together. And yet no one in early Christianity properly speaks of his texts as canon. Of course, we can include Irenaeus and Justin in this as well, though. But no one puts them into a canon list in this sense until 150 years later. Again, this strikes me now as a problem. There is, however, one person who gives us an earlier New Testament canon. Answers on a postcard, your starter for 10. Guess who it is? Well, it's my old friend, Marcion of Sinope. He is the first person to bring these Pauline epistles to light. He is the first person to give us a clear attestation, even before Irenaeus and Justin now, and way before the Muratorian fragment, a clear attestation that these Pauline epistles exist. And this is his New Testament canon. Again, apologies for the white. He gives us his own work, the Antithesis, the Evangelion, which is his gospel, which is rather akin to Luke. And scholars disagree about whether he wrote it himself or whether he inherited it. I personally fall more into the latter category than the first. I think that he inherits this Evangelion. But alongside it, he provides us with Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, Philemon. Isn't that fantastic? We have all of the Pauline epistles attested in 140, in the 140s-ish. 2 things you'll notice. One of them, I've already given it away because I highlighted it in red. Laodiceans is actually, ostensibly, the letter to the Ephesians, but readdressed to the church at Laodicea. The other thing the keen eyes may have noticed in the room is that the ordering of the texts is different. They are no longer in length, but rather in the rough geographical, biographical journeys of Paul. The order in which Marcion believed that they were written. Philemon, for example, he says himself, I wrote as an old man. So, there's good news and bad news to this now. The good news is we found a terminus antiquarum for the writing of Paul's letters. We know for certain they were all written by 140. But I could hear somebody shouting in the background, we knew that. Why are you telling us this? Everyone knows Paul wrote before 140. Yeah, okay, I agree. But this is the earliest I can show for certain they were written. Because anything else prior to this, and this is where the bad news comes in a little bit, is less easy to prove. And the bad news just keeps on coming. The bad news further is that the Marcion that's attested by by Marcion, is not canonical Paul. It's different. In some places, even contradictory to canonical Paul. Suspenseful music plays. There's also some mixed news, and that is that this attestation of the Pauline epistles, even in their Marcionite form, does not necessarily favour either corpus per se. Okay, we're still open, but there's only two possible scenarios now. The first scenario, scenario A, is the consensus view, and it goes something like this. Paul writes a letter, which we'll call A, to Church X, and Church X receives that letter and treasures it in the community. Other churches ask for the epistle to be sent to them because they also want access to Pauline knowledge. And I can imagine this in particular becoming an important factor after Paul dies, because as everyone knows, when someone dies, something immediately becomes more valuable because they know nothing else is going to be produced. If I was receiving a letter from Paul every Thursday, it's less valuable than if I was receiving them once every year, for obvious reasons. So the other churches ask for the epistle to be sent to them, and the church that it was sent to happily obliges. So it's copied and sent. This is a rinse and repeat action, and the texts are now in circulation among churches. This is where it gets interesting. Scholars would now argue that Marcion collects these letters, redacts them in his own image, publishes his new collection, and this becomes the first New Testament. At which point, proto-Catholics say this ain't on, so to speak, and publish their own collection. Now, just a little side note on my contributions, I've used a colloquial term here. This ain't on. I got criticised in the last video I did for using too many colloquialisms and, quote, non-scholarly terminology. I make no apology. I'll continue to do so. So the proto-Catholics did say, this ain't on, and so publish their own. So that's scenario A. What we're saying is Marcion collects texts and redacts them. He publishes them. The proto-Catholics then actually gather the genuine Pauline letters. They publish them as well. The second scenario goes almost the exact same, except instead of Marcion collecting and redacting, Marcion just collects and publishes them as they are. He gives us what he receives. In which proto-Catholics make another objection, this ain't on, but rather than publishing the genuine Pauline letters, they are the corrupters of the text, and they change it in favour of their position over Marcion's. Now, scenario A and scenario B are both possible. I do not want to approach it with a dogmatic point of view that only one or the other can be true. Both at this point, scholars must recognise, are on the table. We may lean one way or the other, and I will show you which way I lean in a minute. But both are possible. The way I lean is more towards scenario B. And the reason why is this. If scenario A is to be believed, the question is, why does no one attest these epistles, and where are they for 70 years? Plus, if the traditional dating is believed to be true. Now, what I mean by that is, although one could level this argument against the Marcionite epistles, again, that claim can only be levelled if the traditional dating is true. But I want to argue that it's both the case that scenario B is true and Marcion does inherit these epistles, but I further want to argue that the dating of these epistles is not actually the 50s and 60s. It is instead probably something more akin to the 80s, perhaps even 90s. That's not to say that Paul wrote nothing, or that elements of genuine Pauline literature are not present in either the canonical or the Marcionite texts we have today. What I'm saying is something far more radical, which is that nothing we have today shows what Paul originally wrote, and it's indecipherable and impossible for us to work out if or what he wrote. But that what we do have today, either canonical or Marcion, is an 80s or 90s creation. So the question of why does no one attest these epistles so early? Why does it take time? It's because they weren't written yet. So instead of waiting 100 years or 90 or 80 years, we actually really only end up waiting 40 years. You might still argue that's a long time, but in some sense it isn't. The dissemination and copying of texts was an exceptionally laborious process. It was also one that was extremely costly. You needed skilled men with great knowledge to spend a lot of time working to produce one letter, particularly the amounts of letters you would need to publish worldwide. There's no printing press. There's no printers. So the only people that can do this or have access to this sort of printing, or not printing, sorry, this scribal transmission are the rich. Who is one of the best people situated to do that? Of course, it's Marcion. He's a wealthy man. He had all of the facilities necessary to publish and copy extensively, and to go out looking and spend time looking for and to collect the Pauline epistles. You see, in those 40 years, it may have been the case that there were lots of Pauline epistles hanging around, or at least those attributed to him. But they were unable to be copied before they were lost. We already suggested there were some lost epistles. There may well be more. The other problem with scenario A is questioning whether theology or the authority of Paul is. People know Paul, but do not speak or regard his work as worthy of comment. We've already mentioned the resurrection. Resurrection mania, Paul's central theme and ideology by which he bases all of his other beliefs on, only really becomes prominent in Christianity after Marcion. I've mentioned it ad nauseum on this podcast, but in his 2012 book, I think it is, Resurrection in Early Christianity, the resurrection mania, as Marcus Vincent calls it, only begins after Marcion resurrects Paul from the apparent dead. People know who Paul is, though. They say his name. They mention him alongside Peter. He's an authority. He's an apostle. He's of God. He's always mentioned after Peter, I should note, as a secondary. But nonetheless, he's authoritative. It would therefore, as night follows day, seem as if he should quote from Paul, or that they should quote from Paul, and they just don't. If the letters existed for all this time in their non-Marcionite form, why does it take Marcion to revitalize Paul and give him that platform again? If the traditional dating is true. The last problem with scenario A comes down to a textual one, and also the motivations. Why would Marcion corrupt Paul? Marcion is utterly infatuated with him. He thinks that Paul is basically one step down from Jesus. The other apostles, no good. Bin them off, so to speak. If Marcion speaks so highly of Paul and then gets his work manipulates, corrupts, destroys it, actually. Destroys so many of the key themes and beliefs and practices that Paul holds dear. What sort of follower of Paul is that? He'd be less a lover of Paul and more an obsessive narcissist, truly only interested in himself. In addition, the precision that he changes, the precision with which he changes, would have had to have changed canonical Paul into Marcionite Paul is unbelievably precise. The grammar, the style, the lexicon. You've got words that are so benign, that mean nothing. Words like in English, like so and therefore. Grammatical choices or stylistic choices, lexicographical choices that are made by authors, because that's just the way they write, are removed in Marcion's work. Why is he removing benign words? It must have been the case, if he did corrupt Paul, that he not just ripped bits out or changed the odd word, he must have rewritten the whole thing, because internally the Marcionite epistles of Paul are so consistent. This is one of the reasons why scholars reject Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, because of grammatical, stylistic, and lexicographical difficulties. In Marcion, they're gone. We do not have these problems in the same way. Another change that he makes, again, something that Jacob and I have been talking about recently, is in the proposed authors. In every case where Paul mentions another author,
It's not there.
it's not there. It's not there. Why has Marcion done that? In addition to that, he doesn't know 1 Timothy in particular or 2 Timothy. If he thought they were Pauline and he had access to them, Marcion would have been their biggest advocate. He was the man you wanted rooting for you on the sidelines when you were playing Little League.
Do you suspect that the co-authors could have been the real names of the scribes that were modifying Paul after Marcion?
Joe, it's really interesting you say that. In a Studia Patristica volume, and I can't remember what volume it is off the top of my head, but there was a great article. Again, I am Marcion to Paul in the case of Meta Marcus Vincent. In Studia Patristica, Vincent wrote an article about how the names in Ignatius of Antioch are used and inserted as sort of like hyperlinks between the different letters. So, for example, to link Ignatius' letter to Polycarp, he includes the name Alki. And then in his letter to Romans, the interpolator inserts it there as well. So it binds those two letters together. Ignatius shows knowledge of the same person. I'd have to do some more thinking about this and some more research. But one of the options here is the scribal element that you've just mentioned. But another element is the Timothy thing. Well, we know that Timothy's an Acts. So whoever wrote Acts, which I also think to be a 2nd century text, may have chosen to include Timothy in some of these letters to legitimize and provide a foundation stone to the authenticity of Acts. It would seem bloody strange if Paul writes all these letters and does all these things at a time when he's meant to be with Timothy and Silas and never mentions him. Where's he gone? So again, it strikes me that seems to be a thing that I would do to bolster the authenticity of both epistles both ways. But that's not to say that what you've just said is not impossible either. All we're doing here is spitballing possibilities.
Yes.
And both those things are possible. But I think there could be some research conducted to at least to falsify my position, or prove it, and we could see whether there are stylistic elements that are similar between Marcion and other texts and Luke and Acts, as we already know. and the Pauline text to see if there's similarities there.
Yeah.
But it's not just the case that there are problems with scenario A. We can also provide a positive outlook in the case of scenario B. As I've already mentioned, the epistles are, for the most part, consistent internally in their lexicon and vocab, etc. More work needs to be done on this. We are not at a point where we can make absolute statements here, but that's the way it's looking. This needs to be compared alongside the rest of the New Testament vocab, and also alongside other early Christian texts. When this is done, maybe then we can say with some more certainty. But this scholarship is so new, it's hot off the press. More work needs to be done. The second solution that we can say is that, well, they are the first attested. I mean, simply put, one argument that I've got over anyone who is an advocate of the canonical 7 letters is that, well, I can show mine were there first. I can show minor corpus first. That's a pretty strong argument. If we were dealing in a case of, who we dig up 2 rocks and we're arguing for 2 different settlements. I don't know if anyone's seen that new series on Netflix with Graham Hancock. It's a bit mad. But, if I dig up a rock in Bolivia and it's 500 BC and you dig up a rock in Rome and it's 500 AD, well, I could say in Bolivia that my civilization is probably older than yours. My rock is older than yours. I have a tangible piece of evidence with which I can point, and you don't. Lastly, Marcion's popularization of the Martial Epistles would explain the delay in resurrection mania and other Pauline concepts. We've mentioned it a couple of times already. But it still would be a question as to why no one picked up the individual letters, or why no one else would want to have created a corpus. But at least we would get some way to explaining a little bit why there might be a delay. So what conclusions do we have, if any? Well, I'm really sorry. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a man for positing things absolutely. I think that there's so much grey here that needs to still be assessed. And that's point 1. We've got a lot of work to do. Scholars must begin to engage with the material on both sides. It may well be the case that scenario A is true. Canonical Paul is great. Marcion Paul is dirty and ugly. But we don't know that yet. Number 2, the dating of the texts, that being the Pauline corpuses, are pre-100. Now, the reason why I say that is because of the lengthy processes it takes to produce and disseminate these letters. And when I say the dating of these texts, I again refrain from saying in their current form. If Paul wrote anything, or even regardless of Paul, the origins of the author who originated this Pauline corpus, they likely wrote pre-100. To give these letters time to work their way out across the world so that they could go through the editing they probably have gone through and to make it through into a Marcionite corpus and other corpuses, they need time. And I can well believe that that is pre-100. Lastly, if the canonical scenario is true, and my inclination is wrong, then the text could probably even be dated earlier. Because if the Marcion scenario, then if the Marcion scenario is true, because it would also have taken time for Marcion to collect these and then corrupt them. I mean, it doesn't give you that much extra room, but nonetheless, there still needs to be that time allocated for that also. So unfortunately, that brings me to the end, and many of your viewers will have probably come away thinking, well, I'm not entirely sure what I learned. All I know is that I know less than I did before, but that's exactly what I wanted. I want us to try and know less so that we can begin to know more at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, my theory that I haven't discussed on this channel too much, and I don't think I really have at all, about the co-authorship of the Pauline epistles. I think it would explain the contradictions that we see in Paul's letters, and I would give a couple of quick examples. Like in First Timothy, Pilate is the one that's blamed for Jesus' death. In First Thessalonians, it was Jesus. Uh, Jesus' death was, let me rephrase that. It was the Jews that was blamed for Jesus' death. And in 1 and 2 Corinthians, we have a different view, that demonic forces were working with rulers, archons, to have Jesus killed. So we have 3 different points of view. The co-authorship theory could explain it, but at the same time, I have to admit, Jack Bull, you have made a very interesting argument today. What you have on your end that I do not have, at least that's so it appears, is that the co-authorship or the co-authors are attested later, and the non-co-authorship is attested earlier. And I also agree with you in either case, as I think I've made clear in prior videos, that I do think Paul's letters, either which way, were written close to the end of the 1st century, around the ballpark of 80 to 100. I would prefer 80 to 96, but I do basically agree. So it is interesting, and I think it would definitely change things if it is the case that the co-authors were added in later in a post-Marcionite proto-Catholic Catholicization of Marcion's Paul, because that is basically what Dr. Price would call it. Paul's epistles were Catholicized. He often likes to put it that way, but that's exactly what it would look like if that scenario is the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a couple of super chat questions. I've been waiting a while, so let's get to them real quick.
Apologies, sorry, I was rambling on.
Oh, no need. I like that you went through the presentation first. I wanted you to go through the presentation first. I didn't want the super chats to interrupt your flow, so I thought that was perfect. JC, thank you for your super chat. He says, great presentation and analysis. In a previous interview, Dr. Vincent mentioned Marcion found several Pauline epistles. Is it possible he wrote them?
So I think there are only 2 options here. Either he found them and rewrote them. I don't think he was the original author of them, or he found them and published them as was. From my mind, I do believe that Marcion is a trustworthy man, and I think he tries his best to attest what he gets more than what he wants to make up. And so my position would be that regardless of whether they're right or wrong, early or not, he only publishes what he gets. I'm not sure that he even rewrites them. That's possible though, and if he does rewrite them, I don't think he would have gone so far as to butcher or manipulate the text beyond its base intention. If that makes sense.
Elias Almodi, thank you for your super chat. Fantastic presentation. Can I ask you of your opinion on Justin Martyr, never referencing or using Paul, despite having every opportunity to do so in his writings against Marcion and Trypho?
I know. I mean, I think the question answers his own question.
Yeah.
What? I mean, this plays straight into my hands again. Now, the only thing I would say about that is that, and again, more work needs to be done on this also. When we get to Tertullian, and he argues against Marcionite Paul, as far as I'm aware, I don't think he references canonical Paul as a counter. So even Tertullian, we're now dealing so much later, is not mentioning canonical Paul. What's more interesting in the case of Justin, though, more than anything, is that he doesn't even mention Paul's name. That's the bit that really surprises me. If he doesn't mention the letters, we've been through this. This doesn't always happen. But the fact he doesn't even call him out. And again, you're only left with sort of 4 possible scenarios, right? 1, Justin did not know Paul. Please have a day off. 2, Justin knew Paul and chose not to use him. 3, Justin knew Paul and disagreed with him outright. Or 4, Justin knew Paul and used him, informally. Now, I would actually present maybe a fifth option here. I think that one of the reasons Justin stays away from Paul is because he's associated with Marcion. I think that's the reason. I think that, to my mind, the canonical account of Paul is post Justin. And therefore, in his mind, these Pauline texts are Marcionite texts. He doesn't want to be associated with Paul. He's of the not the heretic, would be careful in our language. He's of the other man. He's of that other group.
And that would make sense since some church fathers refer to Paul as the apostle of the heretics.
And Apelles takes Paul on as well. I mean, Marcion's not the only one, the Entwistle disciple of Marcion, who abandons him. So, again, it's a bit like as well this reluctance to engage ourselves with the resurrection. Another reason why the resurrection isn't mentioned by early Christians is because it is associated with Gnostics. Again, I'm being careful to use that word. It's not a great accurate description of things, but it's helpful just for this generic chat. Gnosticism is related very strongly with the idea that Jesus doesn't have a physicality. He's a spiritual element. So we just stay away from things. That's to do with you. We can't get involved with that. We see it a bit today. I don't want to raise too many political points here, but like we see it today, if the right feel like the left have a position, regardless of the merits of it, they'll just ignore it altogether, and vice versa. Both are guilty of this.
Very true. Renzo Rodriguez, thank you for your super chat. Please explain how Mark based this gospel on Marcion's.
Wow. So you might have misheard. I actually mentioned it was Luke more specifically that is based on Marcion. In the case of Mark, they do have that same substantial core, which I talked about in my debate with Dr. James Audlin the other day. That there seems to be this central core of gospel material, and then confusion on the extremities. The birth narratives, the resurrection narratives, all the gospels are confused about that. And they're the only parts that Marcion's gospel doesn't really want to comment on too much. He doesn't have a birth narrative, and his resurrection narrative is short and sweet. So if Mark in any sense is related to Marcion, it's that core centre bit. But in the case of Mark 16:8 and onwards, that's not from Marcion. No chance. But it's also not part of Mark. So we have to argue both ways there. In the case of Luke, though, like I said, Luke is almost. It'd be done for plagiarism, yeah. I mean, if Jacob submitted it for his undergrad and I submitted it for my undergrad, he submitted Marcion, I submitted Luke, I'd be done for plagiarism. Yeah, I mean, copy my homework but change it a little. Yeah, they've just, as Robert Price would say it, they've put the Catholic hammer on it and stamped it, and so that's the only similarity.
Brad Kimball, thank you for your super chat. This is great work. Please follow this evidence-based work and avoid opinionated work. Scholars are not geniuses.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the really interesting things you pointed out there, Brad, because I think that at one point, I had a lot of imposter syndrome in academia. I thought I was just like a bit of a thicko, and I didn't really know what I was talking about. But all I realized was that the good scholars were just more confident in their lie, or at least in their assertion. Not lie, that's unfair. In their assertions. The only difference between me and them is I realize I'm not an imposter. I'm just really cautious. I just don't want to get caught out. That's not to say I think it's, of course we've got to make judgment calls as scholars. We can't just sit on the fence forever because that's boring. But we can just say, well, we don't know. And that's a legitimate answer at this point.
Absolutely. I'm not going to name names, but there are some people that actually have criticized me in very strange ways, try to make fun of me for thinking that Paul's letters are post-war. And I told them that, listen, I'm not. It's not like I'm the first. It's not like I'm the first person ever to suggest it. Even if I were, that doesn't mean that I'm crazy. The like the wrath of God upon Judea, 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16. I mean, what is that? That can't be anything but the temple being destroyed. That is every church father, and I know you know this as well as I do. Every church father that talks about the wrath of God, they believe it's Jerusalem being destroyed. This is, and I'm referring specifically to, you know how some church fathers will say the death of James caused the destruction of Jerusalem. There are some apocalyptic texts where James's death is linked to the fall of Jerusalem. In other texts, it's Jesus instead. But in either scenario, the conclusion is much the same, and it resembles the argument we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, there are scholars that do look at it more honestly and say, okay, you're right, there's a problem. Then they sniff it away by saying it's an interpolation. So, and I've had someone else tell me, well, actually, you make very interesting arguments, but I think everything that you just said is a reference to an interpolation. So what I did was I went to my computer, like, okay, what happens if I remove all these instances of so-called interpolations because it contradicts the consensus dating and it's a mess? It just doesn't make any sense. And I think that what you're doing, looking at Marcion's collection of Paul, makes better sense, has a consistent methodology, rather than the uncontrolled methodology of cherry picking what we don't like in Paul. Mike8903, thank you for your super chat. So when do you think 1 Clement is written? He mentions Paul as one of the most recent spiritual heroes.
So, Mike, I'm really interested in that question. That is a question that is piercing its way through my frontal cortex as I go to sleep every night, and is keeping my fiance on the phone for hours, who is completely uninterested in these subjects, because I think 1 Clement also remains, as the Ignatian Corpus did before myself and Marcus got their grubby mitts on it, one of the unanswered questions of the Apostolic Fathers. I am continuously surprised that Polycarp's letter to the Philippians has reams and reams of literature on it for like barely any a letter like this bloody big. Whereas 1 Clement gets overlooked, and people are far more interested in the theology than they are the makeup of it. I don't think that 1 Clement is one letter, first of all. And I hope to prove that using the same technique as I have with the Ignatian epistles at some point. I might be proved wrong after my analysis, but my hunch leads me to think that it's a composite, a bit like Philippians. If that's the case, we then need to work out which bit's older, which bit's younger, etc., etc. I think that 1 Clement probably does stem back in its original form to the dating of Clement. Maybe 100, maybe 90. Let's go really brave. But when we get our final form, this is not a text of an early Christian. This is not a text of someone at that time. It doesn't fit what else we have around it. But I emphasize again, that's something that I'll find out as I go on my research. I'm hoping to write an IRC or an AHRC grant for this. But just to let you into the other background of academia, a lot of young scholars are dependent on early research grants to do their job. And they're not interested in the type of work I do, that most of these grant bodies. They think it's dry, they think it's uncommercial, which it is. I mean, I'm not denying that. It's not fun. And no one thinks, oh, I'd love to see how many times the word ara is used in a second century text. No one does that. But it needs to be done, and this is why I don't think I'll be able to continue academia and pursue the same things as I want to do. After I complete my next project, which will be a fresh translation of the Ignatian Syriac epistles into Greek, which is again something people don't want me to do because I think it's silly, and into English, then I'm going to pursue a stylistic and linguistic analysis of 1 Clement. I mean, I'd love it if someone got there before me and did it, because it would save me a lot of time and effort. But I think that's something that we need to look at again.
Elias Almodi, thank you for your super chat. Jack, if academia doesn't get you employed immediately, you have a great opportunity in underwear modeling.
I guess that might be a reference to a tweet that I put out the other day. A friend of mine put out a tweet about shopping for male underwear. It can sometimes be a bit homoerotic because there's lots of men standing there quite, ripped. And so I posted on Twitter a picture of myself in my underwear and said, at ASOS, if you want to employ someone, I'm really poor right now. But I don't think my dad bod beer belly is quite going to cut the mustard for that sort of thing. It also probably doesn't look good for future employers, but maybe I'll take it down.
Renzo Rodriguez, thank you for your super chat. Do you think there was any Christianity between 33 and Paul's letters? How do you imagine it? What if Jesus actually died just before 70?
Well, I mean, I do subscribe to the idea that Jesus was crucified around 33 AD, and I do think that Christianity exists. in that period. I also don't think I just see, well, picture it again. I've just seen the chat. I do think Christianity exists at that time, and I think that it is small, and I think that it's slow, and I think that it's also probably indistinguishable for almost everyone from Judaism. It's Judaism, but we like Jesus. It's basically what it is. And in early Christianity, including in early Christian texts, we get no great development of doctrine, right? I mean, even by the time you get to the 4th century, nobody's really sure if Jesus is God. So certainly no Christians are asking these huge questions in between Jesus' death and Paul. But I do think something exists. I think it must be almost undiscoverable of how small they were. But we need my archaeological friends would be a far better place to do that than me, because I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just someone who reads books.
I'll reply to this. Let me first say, if there's anything that we do know, is Jesus died under Pilate by a crucifixion. Trying to date his crucifixion to around 70, which is what somebody else does. I don't feel like mentioning him right now. I've mentioned him more than enough times in videos I've done criticizing him in the past. It's just, no offense, but stupid. To think Jesus died in 70 is absurd. What that other guy is saying, I'm not talking about you, Renzo. I'm talking about what the other person that I don't want to name right now said. But yeah, I basically agree that Christianity in some form did exist since at least the 30s. Probably wasn't called by that name. I suspect the term Christianity probably is later, much later.
Yeah, and well, interesting. I mean, one of the first places it appears is in Antioch, home of Ignatius, who also uses the term. So again, I agree. It certainly wasn't called Christianity. Hodos, followers of the way, who knows? But I mean, I agree that Jesus was probably, for the same reasons you mentioned about Pilate, and also even in Marcion's gospel, he mentions the reign of Tiberius.
Yeah, he does at the very beginning.
Exactly, and unlike Luke, who then makes a cack hand of it by confusing who the high priest was, Marcion doesn't. And again, Marcion's gospel, I think, can be relatively trusted because he only, even stuff he disagrees with, he allows to be included in his gospel. Stuff that wouldn't come naturally to him, like the drawing of the sword, like Jesus being called King of the Jews. These are not Marcionite things. He'd much rather probably they wouldn't be there. But he allows them to happen inside his gospel. And so when he says, in the 9th year of the reign of Tiberius, I think, yeah, probably.
Well, thanks for coming on today, Jack Bull.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for listening to my ramblings. And please do check out my website and Patreon. It'd be great to just hear from you guys, and forget monetary support. That's handy, but hopefully I'll have a job anyway in the real world. But just be great to hear. Always great to hear from you guys.
And once the Discord server is reopened to the public, I'll put the link up in the community tab, and I'll make another video about it. In the meantime, I'll also put in the community tab Jack Bull's his Patreon page. I highly recommend you guys go check it out. Anyway, thanks again, Bull.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thanks to everyone.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.